The year was 1777, a time when the very soul of the American colonies hung in a precarious balance, suspended between the hope of liberty and the cold, crushing weight of imperial might. While the textbooks focus on the grand maneuvers of Washington's army, the true pulse of the revolution beat in the shadows, in the secret movements of supplies that traveled like blood through the veins of a hidden nation. This is the chronicle of the Seven-Star Convoy, a mission so classified that its name was never whispered in the halls of Congress, and its cargo was meant to change the physical foundation of the war itself. The midnight gathering at the forge. The journey began in the dead of winter at an isolated iron forge hidden deep within the Susquehanna River Valley. The forge, known only as the Silent Anvil, was a place of smoke and heat, but on this night the fires were kept low. The air was a brittle, crystalline blue, so cold that the very breath of the men and horses hung in the air like frozen ghosts. The ground was iron hard, covered in a thin, treacherous layer of hoarfrost that shimmered under the light of a dying moon. Captain Silas Vane stood by the lead wagon, his tall frame cloaked in a heavy, indigo-dyed wool coat that had seen better days. Vane was not a traditional soldier. He was a man of the earth, a surveyor who understood the geometry of the wilderness. In his gloved hand, he gripped a leather satchel that contained the Midnight Manifest. This document was the heart of the convoy, a vellum map marked with coordinates that didn't correspond to any public trail. It was a guide through the Iron Meridian, a series of magnetic paths known only to a few elite scouts. The loading process was a masterclass in 18th century stealth. 7 massive wagons, built from seasoned white oak and reinforced with blackened iron, were being filled. But they were not carrying gunpowder or grain. Instead, they were loaded with the Iron Meridian, crates of high-density magnetite, specialized charcoal from ancient hemlock trees, and lead-sealed canisters of secret industrial blueprints. The weight was immense. The oak floorboards of the wagons groaned under the pressure, a sound that Vane feared would carry for miles in the crystalline silence of the night. The silent architecture of the convoy. To ensure absolute silence, every piece of metal on the wagons had been treated. The iron bands around the wheels had been dipped in a mixture of whale oil and graphite to prevent the piercing shrieks of friction. The horses, Percherons bred for their immense power and calm temperament, had their hooves wrapped in thick canvas and hemp rope. This was the muffled gait, a technique that turned the thundering sound of a heavy convoy into a dull, rhythmic thumping that sounded nothing more than the distant pulse of the river. The men assigned to the convoy were shadow breakers, specialists in nocturnal navigation. There were 21 of them, 3 for each wagon, and they moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of months of training. They did not speak. They communicated through a series of subtle hand signals and the rhythmic clicking of small wooden blocks. Conversation was a luxury they could not afford, as the British scouts were known to be patrolling the lower ridges, their ears tuned to any anomaly in the winter wind. As the clocks in the distant, unseen towns struck midnight, Vane gave the signal. A single shuttered lantern was opened for a split second, its light reflecting off the 7 stars of the convoy's formation. The wagons began to move, their wheels biting into the frozen earth with a sound like grinding teeth. They were leaving the safety of the valley and entering the dark, vertical world of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The first ascent into the hemlock gloom. The climb began immediately. The trail was a narrow ribbon of darkness that wound its way up the slopes of the ridge. On either side, the forest pressed in, towering hemlocks and skeletal oaks that seemed to reach out with frozen fingers. The canopy was so dense that it blocked out the stars, leaving the men in a world of near total visual null. They navigated by the line of the lead horse, following the faint pale tail of the horse in front of them. This part of the journey was a test of endurance. The wagons, heavy with iron, fought against the gravity of the mountain. The horses strained, their muscles rippling under their coats, their sweat turning to ice as soon as it hit the air. Vane walked beside the lead horse, his hand on its neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat. He could feel the tug of the meridian, the way the heavy iron cargo seemed to align itself with the magnetic pull of the mountain. The sound of the ascent was a boring symphony. It was a repetitive, low-frequency drone, the creak of the oak, the thud of the canvas-wrapped hooves, and the heavy rhythmic breathing of the men. It was a sound that invited a state of semi-consciousness, a trance-like focus that allowed the men to ignore the biting cold and the exhaustion. In this state, the mountain began to feel like a living entity, a giant made of stone and ice that was slowly drawing them into its depths. The weight of the secret. As they reached the first plateau, known as the Weaver's Bench, Vane ordered a brief halt. He needed to check the midnight manifest. Inside the lead wagon, under the dim glow of a candle shielded by a wooden box, he opened the leather satchel. The vellum was cold to the touch. The ink, a special mineral-based dye, looked almost silver in the low light. The manifest contained instructions that defied logic. At the height of the hemlock line, the needle shall fail. Trust the weight of the iron. The mountain knows the way. Vane understood that the Iron Meridian they were following was not a path made by man, but a path made by the Earth's own magnetic field. The gold and documents they carried were vital, but the iron was the key. Without the iron, they could not navigate the magnetic whispers that lay ahead. The soldiers huddled near the wagons, their breath mingling to form a collective cloud of steam. They ate dry biscuits in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the dark tree line. They were at the edge of the known world. Above them lay the higher ridges, where the air was thinner and the legends of vanishing patrols were more common. They were the silent convoy, and their burden was not just the cargo, but the weight of a nation's future that rested on their ability to remain invisible. As the wind began to howl through the Needle Pass above them, Vane closed the manifest. He looked back at his 7 wagons, lined up like a constellation on the frozen plateau. They were ready. They were no longer just men and horses. They were a singular machine, a mechanical meridian moving through the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The second phase of the journey was about to begin, and the mountain was waiting.
The transition from the lower slopes to the high ridges of the Blue Ridge was not merely a change in altitude, but a shift in the very laws of the physical world. As the Seven-Star Convoy passed the threshold of the Needle Pass, they entered the magnetite corridor, a geological anomaly that had baffled surveyors for decades. Here, the ancient granite of the Appalachians was shot through with veins of magnetite so pure and so dense that they exerted a physical pull on everything that contained iron, the wagon bands, the horseshoes, and the very blood in the men's veins. The failure of the instruments. Captain Silas Vane held his brass surveyor's compass in the palm of his hand, watching it by the faint filtered light of the moon. This was a precision instrument, crafted in London and calibrated to the finest degree. But as they moved deeper into the corridor,
The needle began to behave as if it had been possessed. It didn't point toward the North Star. Instead, it began a slow, agonizingly smooth rotation, tracing a perfect circle. Then, with a sharp clack, the needle snapped against the side of the casing, pulled by an invisible force that existed deep within the mountain's core. "The compass is dead," Vane whispered to himself, the sound of his own voice feeling heavy and muffled in the dense air. He looked up at the sky, but the 7 stars of the Big Dipper were now obscured by a strange metallic mist, a fine suspension of mineral dust that hung in the air, catching the moonlight and turning it into a flat gray glare. The convoy was now instrument blind, relying entirely on the midnight manifest and the sensory feedback of the mountain itself. The anatomy of the magnetic pull. The weight of the cargo, the Iron Meridian, now became a double-edged sword. The magnetite in the wagons was being pulled toward the magnetite in the mountain. The horses, usually capable of pulling thousands of pounds, began to lather and tremble. To the human eye, the trail ahead looked perfectly level, a flat shelf of frozen stone. Yet the horses strained as if they were climbing a 45-degree incline. This was the sensory distortion zone, where the magnetic pull created a phantom gravity that defied the visual horizon. Vane ordered the men to dismount and walk beside the horses. He could feel it in his own body, a strange leaden heaviness in his limbs, and a constant low-frequency hum vibrating through the soles of his boots. The mountain was speaking through the iron. Every step felt like wading through knee-deep water. The silence of the forest was replaced by a new sound, the magnetite whispers. It wasn't an acoustic sound heard by the ears, but a bone conduction vibration that filled the skull. It was the sound of millions of tons of stone vibrating at a frequency that matched the human heart. To keep the men focused, Vane instituted the iron count. Every 100 paces, the man at the front of each wagon would strike the iron rim of the wheel with a small wooden mallet. The sound, a dull metallic thud, served as a grounding point, a way to break the hypnotic trance that the magnetic hum was inducing. If the sound was sharp, the ground was stable. If it was hollow, it meant they were passing over a void vein, a hollow pocket in the rock where the magnetism was at its most dangerous. The Twisted Hemlock Labyrinth. The vegetation in the magnetite corridor was a testament to centuries of invisible struggle. The hemlocks here did not grow straight toward the sun. Instead, their trunks were twisted into elaborate corkscrew shapes, their branches gnarled and reaching toward specific outcrops of magnetic rock. It was a forest of iron trees, where the wood itself had absorbed so much mineral content that it was nearly as hard as stone. The wagons moved through this labyrinth like ghosts. The muffled gait of the horses and the oiled wheels made the procession look like a silent film played in slow motion. The gray veil of mineral dust began to settle on the men's coats, turning their dark indigo uniforms into a ghostly ashen silver. They were becoming a part of the mountain's palette, their identities slowly being erased by the geological environment. Inside the lead wagon, the Midnight Manifest was undergoing a transformation. The lead-lined box protected the vellum, but the air inside had become ionized. When Vane opened the box to consult the map, small sparks of blue static electricity, St. Elmo's fire, danced along the edges of the pages. The ink, made from iron gall, seemed to pulsate, the letters expanding and contracting as if they were alive. Vane followed the tactile map, running his fingers over the raised letters, feeling the magnetic intensity of the path ahead. The trance of the Meridian. As the night wore on, the men fell into a state of magnetic lethargy. Their thoughts became slow and repetitive, circling around single images, the turn of a wheel, the breath of a horse, the gray texture of the bark. This was the goal of the boring history, to describe the absolute crushing weight of a journey that had no landmarks, only the internal sensation of movement through a medium that resisted them. The sergeant of the second wagon, a grizzled veteran of the 7 Years' War, found himself staring at the iron band of his wheel. He began to see patterns in the way the hoarfrost formed on the metal, geometric shapes that seemed to mimic the constellations they could no longer see. He wasn't afraid, he was simply elsewhere. The mountain had stripped away the urgency of the war. General Washington, the British, the concept of a new nation, all of it felt like distant, unimportant dreams compared to the reality of the iron and the stone. Vane saw the signs of the trance in his men and knew he had to keep them moving. If they stopped for too long, the magnetic pull would anchor them to the spot, making it impossible for the horses to restart the heavy loads. "Keep the rhythm," he would whisper, his voice barely audible over the internal hum. "The iron must move, the meridian must be crossed." The edge of the void. By the end of the fourth night, the convoy reached the end of the magnetite corridor and looked out over the gray plateau. The air here was even thinner, and the temperature had dropped to a point where the mercury in a thermometer would have frozen solid. The magnetic pull had reached its crescendo, a vibrating tension that felt like a stretched bowstring. Before them lay a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, flat, cratered, and covered in a fine white dust that wasn't snow, but pulverized quartz. There were no trees here, only jagged shards of granite that rose from the earth like the teeth of a buried dragon. This was the entrance to the frozen echo, the final stage of their physical journey, and the beginning of their historical disappearance. Vane looked back at his 7 wagons. They were battered, gray with dust, and trembling from the strain, but they were still in formation, a terrestrial 7 stars mirrored against the dark bulk of the ridge. He adjusted the weight of the manifest in his pocket. He could feel the mountain preparing for the next phase. The whispers were growing louder, turning from a hum into a low-frequency roar that signaled the collapse of the atmospheric pressure. The night the snow stopped falling was upon them. As the Seven-Star Convoy slowly crested the final rise leading into the high-altitude basin of the Gray Plateau, they crossed an invisible boundary of atmospheric pressure. This was the heart of the place of the held breath. The temperature had reached a level so low that it transcended the simple sensation of cold. It had become a dry, searing weight that seemed to extract the very moisture from the eyes and lungs. It was the night of December 19th, 1777. For hours, a relentless, heavy snow had been falling, fat, wet flakes that clotted on the horses' manes and built up in drifts against the wagon wheels. But at exactly 12 minutes past midnight, as Captain Vane's lead horse stepped onto a flat shelf of dark granite, the world underwent a transformation that defied every law of nature known to the 18th century. The snow did not taper off. It did not drift away with the wind. It simply stopped. The stasis of the heavens. Silas Vane pulled back on the reins, his breath catching in his throat. Around him, millions of snowflakes hung suspended in the air. They were frozen in mid-descent, hovering like crystalline insects trapped in amber. There was no wind to move them. There was no gravity, it seemed, to pull them to the earth. Vane reached out a gloved hand and touched a single snowflake hanging at eye level. It didn't melt. It didn't fall. It felt like a tiny, sharp grain of glass. He looked back at his men, and he saw them frozen in similar states of shock. The Seven-Star Convoy had entered a static null zone, a pocket of the atmosphere where the intense magnetic field of the mountain had neutralized the kinetic energy of the storm. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was not the absence of noise, but a positive, heavy pressure of silence, the acoustic absorption. When Vane tried to shout an order to his sergeant, his words felt as though they were made of lead. They fell from his lips and vanished instantly into the dry, ionized air. No echo returned from the surrounding cliffs. The sound of his heart beating was the only thing he could hear, echoing in his own ears like a muffled drum. The rise of the gray veil. While the sky remained frozen in its crystalline stasis, the earth beneath them began to stir. From the deep fissures in the granite basin, a thick gray vapor began to rise. This was not the mist of water, it was the mineral exhalation. Pulverized particles of quartz, magnetite, and ancient volcanic ash were being lifted from the mountain's core by a sudden surge in the magnetic meridian. This gray veil began to settle over everything. It coated the dark indigo coats of the soldiers, turning them into statues of ashen silver. It covered the heavy oak wagons, filling the grain of the wood with fine metallic dust. The horses, their muscles locked in a state of biological shock, stood as if they had been carved from marble. Their breath no longer formed ribbons of steam. It was as if they had ceased to breathe entirely, their internal systems slowing down to match the geological pace of the mountain. Vane reached into his coat and felt for the midnight manifest. He could feel the heat radiating through the leather satchel. The iron gall ink on the vellum was reacting to the sudden surge in electromagnetic tension. He knew, with a surveyor's intuition, that the frozen echo was a precursor to a total geological collapse. The mountain was not just holding its breath, it was preparing to swallow the 7 stars. The liquefaction of the granite. At approximately 1 a.m., the vibration began. It was a sound so low that it was felt in the marrow of the bones rather than heard. It was the sub-acoustic roar of the Appalachians. Under this frequency, the solid granite floor of the basin began to behave like a liquid. This was the seismic thixotropy, a phenomenon where high-frequency vibrations turn solid earth into a temporary fluid. The wagons did not crash or splinter. There was no sudden catastrophe. Instead, they began to sink with a slow, agonizing grace. The heavy oak wheels, wrapped in their muffled hemp, disappeared inch by inch into the gray, swirling slurry of the basin floor. Vane watched as the 7th wagon, the one carrying the secret industrial blueprints and the most dense load of magnetite, subsided into the earth. The horses went with them, their heads held high, their eyes calm and distant as they were pulled into the mountain's embrace. There was no struggle. In the frozen echo, the transition from life to geology was seamless. The vanishing of the 7 stars. Vane found himself sinking as well. He didn't feel fear. He felt a strange sense of completion. The Iron Meridian had brought them home. The manifest in his hand was now vibrating so violently that it felt like a living heart. As the gray silt reached his chest, he looked up one last time. The snowflakes were still hanging there, motionless in the dark. The 7 stars of the Big Dipper were beginning to peek through the thinning mist, as if witnessing the burial of their terrestrial namesakes. The mountain was closing its mouth. The liquid granite was thickening, turning back into solid stone as the magnetic surge reached its peak and then began to dissipate. By the time the first light of dawn touched the gray plateau, the atmospheric void had collapsed. The frozen snow finally fell, covering the basin with a fresh, undisturbed layer of white that was 3 feet deep. There were no wagon ruts. There were no horse tracks. There was only the vast white silence of the Blue Ridge. The 7-Star Convoy had not just disappeared, it had been integrated. It was now a part of the mountain's skeletal structure, a secret of iron and oak resting in the permanent, pressurized dark of the frozen echo.
For over a century and a half, the 7-Star Convoy remained in a state of living burial beneath the gray plateau. The mountain did not destroy the wagons through the violent crushing of stone or the rot of damp earth. Instead, it preserved them through a rare, agonizingly slow geological process known as mineral substitution. As the decades drifted past in the total darkness of the substrata, the organic materials of the convoy, the seasoned white oak of the wagon beds, the cured leather of the horse harnesses, and even the twisted fibers of the hemp ropes were gradually replaced, atom by atom, by the mineral-rich waters filtering through the Blue Ridge's iron-veined granite. When a team of geological surveyors finally stumbled upon a hidden cavern system beneath the basin in the early 1900s, they did not find the splintered remains of a wreck. They did not find the hollowed-out skeletons of a forgotten army. Instead, they found the calcified iron, a ghostly, stone-hard recreation of the 1777 expedition, frozen in a state of crystalline perfection. The architecture of the crystalline vault, the cavern which the surveyors would later name the Crystalline Vault, was a masterpiece of natural preservation, a cathedral built by time and chemistry. Because of the extreme concentration of magnetite and calcium carbonate in the surrounding rock, the entire convoy had been encased in a protective shell of calcite and iron silt. The 7 wagons stood in their original precise formation, but they had been transformed into massive, dark gray statues of mineralized oak. The wheels, once composed of flexible wood and iron bands, were now solid blocks of iron-stained quartz. Every spoke was perfectly preserved, every microscopic grain of the original wood now rendered in shimmering, translucent crystal. This was the Lost Forge, where the mountain had taken the raw industrial iron of the American Revolution and refined it into a permanent geological record. To stand in the vault was to stand inside a clock that had stopped. The air was sterile, chilled to a constant, unchanging temperature that prevented any form of biological decay. There was no rust on the iron fittings, for the high magnetic field had created an ionized atmosphere that repelled oxidation. The wagons looked as though they had been dipped in a vat of liquid silver and then allowed to harden for 1,000 years. The fossilization of a single moment. The preservation was so intricate
that the surveyors could see the evidence of the frozen echo in the very posture of the remains. The horses, now completely transformed into calcium-rich stone, were frozen in mid-stride, their muscular frames shimmering with a fine coating of druzy quartz. Their manes, which had been charged with static electricity during the final moments of the 1777 surge, were preserved as delicate, hair-like crystalline structures, standing straight up as if still reacting to a phantom current. This was the fossilization of motion. It was a snapshot of a single, terrifying second in 1777, captured and held by the Earth's crust. The surveyors noted that the eyes of the stone horses were made of clear calcite, reflecting the light of their lanterns with an eerie, lifelike depth. It was as if the animals were not dead, but merely waiting for the magnetic spell to break. The most stunning discovery was the state of the Iron Meridian cargo itself. The heavy bars of iron ore had fused with the floor of the cavern, creating a metallic reef that pulsed with a faint, residual magnetic charge. When a surveyor brought a modern steel tool near the stone wagons, the tool would vibrate in his hand, drawn toward the calcified remains by a pull that had not diminished in over 100 years. The shielded secrets, the lead silence. While the wood and leather had surrendered to the mountain, the lead-wrapped canisters remained defiant. Because lead is chemically inert and resistant to the mineral-laden waters of the ridge, it had acted as a chemical shield. Inside the stone-encased wagons, the surveyors found these lead tubes sitting in dry, pressurized pockets of air. When the first canister was opened in a laboratory months later, the Midnight Manifest was found inside. The vellum was still supple. The silver-tinted ink was still dark and legible. The document was a time capsule of 18th century industrial genius, containing formulas for metallurgy that the world thought were lost forever. The manifest proved that the convoy had not been lost to incompetence, but to a geological event that was beyond human comprehension. The magnetic flowstone. Geologists who studied the crystalline vault noted a phenomenon they called magnetic flowstone. In a typical limestone cave, stalactites hang straight down towards the center of the earth, but in the vault of the Seven Stars, the stone formations grew at impossible angles. They curved and arched toward the iron wagons, drawn by the magnetic meridian. These stone ribs created a series of jagged arches over the convoy, making the site look like the interior of a great prehistoric beast that had swallowed a fleet of ships. The vault was a place of subterranean equilibrium. It was a world where the boring and repetitive cycles of water and mineral had slowly overwritten the frantic, urgent history of the war above. While the United States grew from a collection of colonies into a global power, while cities were built and forests were cleared, the Seven-Star Convoy sat in total darkness, its molecules being traded for the molecules of the mountain. The surveyors eventually realized that to move the wagons would be to destroy them. The calcified stone was brittle. The crystalline manes of the horses would shatter at the touch of a human hand. The convoy had become a permanent part of the Blue Ridge's skeletal system. It was no longer a military supply train. It was a geological monument to a secret mission. Before sealing the cavern once more, the lead surveyor left a single modern coin on the seat of Captain Vane's stone wagon, a small tribute from one century to another. He closed the heavy iron door they had installed, leaving the lost forge to its internal magnetic rhythm. The Iron Meridian had found its final, silent resting place, locked away in a coffin of stone, light, and magnetism that was never meant to be opened by the world of the living.
The final sealing of the iron doors leading to the crystalline vault in the early 20th century marked the end of the human narrative for the Seven-Star Convoy. But for the mountain, the story continued in a state of eternal, rhythmic vibration. Today, the Gray Plateau stands as a vast, high-altitude wilderness in the heart of the Pennsylvania Blue Ridge, a landscape that functions as a silent sentinel. It is a place where history has not been forgotten, but rather has been woven into the very molecular structure of the Earth itself. To the casual observer, it is merely a forest of ancient hemlocks and jagged granite. But to those who understand the geological silence, it is a living, breathing tomb of the American Revolution. The phenomenon of the acoustic shadow. In our modern era, characterized by the constant hum of satellites and the precision of global positioning systems, the Gray Plateau exists as a blank spot on the map of human technology. Pilots flying over this specific coordinate in the Appalachians frequently report a phenomenon known as the electronic null. Their instruments, designed for the digital age, often flicker and stutter, their radio frequencies momentarily replaced by a faint, rhythmic thrumming that sounds like a heartbeat made of metal. This is the acoustic shadow, a lingering resonance of the magnetite veins that once claimed Captain Silas Vane's mission. The mountain acts as a natural dampener, a sound sink that swallows the noises of the 21st century. To the hiker who wanders into this zone, the transition is startling. You cross a specific threshold marked by trees that grow in strange magnetic spirals, and the sounds of the world simply evaporate. The chirping of birds, the rustle of the wind, even the sound of your own footsteps becomes muted, as if the air itself has become too thick to carry sound. This is the auditory suspension, a physical manifestation of the mountain's enduring secret. The unmarked grave, a monument of stone and iron. There are no bronze plaques on the Gray Plateau. There are no marble obelisks to commemorate the 21 men and the 7 wagons that vanished in the winter of 1777. The mountain has refused to allow for an artificial monument because it has become the monument itself. The 7 stars of the convoy are now so deeply integrated into the lithosphere that they are indistinguishable from the natural bedrock. Over the centuries, the iron from the wagon wheels and the heavy magnetite cargo has leached into the surrounding granite, creating a subterranean network of metallic veins. Scientists call this the Iron Meridian. It is a literal foundation of metal that anchors the plateau to the Earth's magnetic core. If one were to peel back the layers of soil and moss, they would find a landscape that is as much machine as it is mountain, a network of calcified oak and crystallized iron that serves as the skeletal remains of a nation's birth. The Midnight Manifest, while preserved in the National Archives, remains one of the most classified documents in American history. It is a dead file, a record of a debt that was never paid and a cargo that was never delivered. It sits in a climate-controlled vault in Washington, D.C., a single lead-lined cylinder containing the maps of a world that no longer exists. It is the administrative twin to the stone wagons, a silent witness to a moment when the revolution was almost lost to the hunger of the earth. The legend of the humming snow.
In the valley towns below the ridge, where the modern world feels distant on cold winter nights, the legend of the humming snow persists. The elders tell stories of the night when the air becomes brittle, a term they use for the extreme atmospheric pressure that preceded the disappearance of the convoy. They say that on the nights of the new moon, when the stars of the Big Dipper are at their zenith, the snow on the gray plateau does not fall in silence. Instead, as the flakes touch the mineral-rich ground, they vibrate. A faint, melodic ringing can be heard, a sound like thousands of tiny silver bells being struck in unison. This is the vibration of the calcified iron reacting to the magnetic pulse of the mountain. It is a gentle, soothing sound, a boring melody that repeats with the precision of a planetary orbit. It is the sound of the lost forge maintaining its equilibrium. It is not a sound of mourning, but of a profound geological peace. The final alignment, as above, so below. The true power of the silent sentinel lies in its connection to the heavens. Every night, the constellation of the 7 stars, the Big Dipper, rotates around the North Star, casting its faint light over the Pennsylvania ridges. For a few brief minutes at midnight, the stars in the sky align perfectly with the positions of the 7 stone wagons deep beneath the plateau. This is the celestial echo. At this moment of alignment, the magnetic pole of the mountain is said to reach its peak. The Iron Meridian hums in sympathy with the stars, a bridge between the earth and the infinite. The Seven-Star Convoy is no longer a lost military unit. It has been promoted to a cosmic constant. It is a part of the Earth's anatomy, a silent sentinel that guards the transition between what is seen and what is hidden. The journey of Captain Silas Vane is finally complete. He and his men did not fail their mission, they merely changed its nature. They became the guardians of the mountain's secrets, the human core of a geological miracle. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this history, let your mind drift toward that high, silent plateau. Feel the cold, dry air, hear the humming snow, and see the stone wagons standing in their eternal, crystalline formation. The war is over, the secrets are safe, and the mountain is at rest. The Iron Meridian remains, a silent, beautiful, and permanent record of a time when the earth chose to keep a secret for itself.